Okay, so welcome to another deep dive with us. And today we are looking at some pretty intense legal stuff happening in the U.S. District Court for the District of Kansas.
Yeah, so we have this verified complaint that was just filed on April 7th, 2025
Mm.
by Meghann R. Miller
Okay.
against Randy R. McCalla, Julia C. Battle, J. Stephen Hazel in Johnson County, Kansas.
Wow, so right off the bat, this sounds pretty serious. What are we talking about here?
So this complaint centers around allegations of violations of civil rights,
Uh-huh.
the Americans with Disabilities Act, and even state law.
Okay.
And all this stems from an ongoing child custody battle that's been happening in the Johnson County District Court. The case number for that is 17CV03002.
Okay, so a child custody case that has now escalated to a federal lawsuit with some pretty weighty accusations being made.
Exactly. And you know what really jumps out at me is just the urgency of the situation.
Right,
You have Meghann Miller. She's basically alleging misconduct within the legal system itself,
right.
and she's fighting to regain custody of her children. So,
Yeah. Okay, so for this deep dive, our goal is to really break down what these core allegations are and sort of like the timeline of events that have led us to this point.
absolutely.
Now, we have some key documents that we're going to be looking at today. We've got excerpts from the verified complaint itself. We have Ms. Miller's verified declaration, so that's her sworn testimony.
Right.
And we also have her ex parte emergency motion for a temporary restraining order.
Mm.
Now, before we jump into all of that, can you just quickly clarify for our listeners what ex parte means in this context and why would she be filing it that way?
Sure. So ex parte basically means that she's going to the court and asking for this immediate action, but without giving notice to the other parties involved.
Okay.
And the reason for that, as she states in the motion, is a fear that, giving them notice could lead to tampering with evidence or further retaliation against her.
Okay, so it's like a request for emergency relief based on her sworn testimony before the other side can potentially interfere.
Exactly. It speaks to the urgency of the situation as she perceives it.
Got it. So let's start from the beginning.
Okay.
When do things really kick off in this case?
Well, according to the complaint and Mrs. Miller's declaration, things really start heating up around January 29th, 2024.
Okay.
That's when we see Randy McCalla, who is the court-appointed guardian ad litem, essentially an advocate for the children in these proceedings.
Right.
He files an emergency motion to modify custody.
Okay.
And this motion was significant because it was based on a report that had been prepared by Julia Battle,
Okay.
who's another key player in all of this.
So we have this report from Julia Battle, and then things seem to move pretty quickly from there, right?
Yeah, they do. So that same day, January 29th, there's an in-camera hearing held before Judge Kevin O'Grady.
Okay, now for those of you who aren't familiar with legal terms, an in-camera hearing is basically a private review conducted by the judge, usually in their chambers.
Right, not in the open courtroom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So can you tell us what happened during this private hearing and what was the outcome?
So during that in-camera hearing, Judge O'Grady, he reviews Julia Battle's report privately. And following that review, a pretty drastic action is taken.
Okay.
Meghann Miller's parenting time with her 5 children, they range in age from 11 to 17, is immediately suspended.
Wow, just like that.
Yeah, so it's a huge decision, obviously a major disruption for the family.
And what's striking is that Ms. Miller claims she wasn't even given a chance to respond to the allegations before this happened.
That's a big part of her complaint. She says she was not questioned. She wasn't allowed to present her side of the story or to challenge anything in that report before her kids were taken away.
And to be clear, the formal written order suspending her parenting time that didn't come until later on February 21st, 2024.
Right. But the actual separation from her kids, that happens on January 29th,
Right.
the day of that hearing.
Now, there's another important detail from that same day, January 29th, that I want to touch on.
Okay.
Because it seems especially relevant given the claims that were being made. There was the issue of drug testing, right?
Yes. So on that same day, Mrs. Miller undergoes both a hair follicle test and a urinalysis.
Okay.
Both of those tests come back negative for any illicit substances.
Okay. So no illegal drugs.
Right. The hair follicle test does show therapeutic levels of amphetamine,
Okay.
which Mrs. Miller explains is completely consistent with the medication she's prescribed for ADHD.
Okay.
And that's later confirmed by her doctor. But despite these negative test results, Battle's report were just ignored.
So basically, it seems like the court's initial actions were heavily influenced by this report from Julia Battle.
That's right. It really set things in motion.
So let's dig into the specifics of what was alleged in that report and how Mrs. Miller is trying to refute those allegations?
Okay, so according to the complaint, the guardian ad litem, Randy McCalla, he tells the court that Miller's children had made allegations of inappropriate sexual disclosures. These claims included things like Miss Miller teaching them about oral sex, watching pornography with them, and even emotionally manipulating them to speak well of her.
Those are incredibly serious accusations, and it sounds like Battle's report basically backed up these claims but then went even further.
Yeah, so the complaint states that Battle's report not only repeated these sexual and emotional abuse allegations, but also added a claim that Miss Miller was abusing alcohol.
Now, hold on. We just talked about how her drug test on that same day showed no alcohol.
Exactly, and that's a key point that Mrs. Miller is emphasizing.
Okay.
She claims to have documentation that disproves all these allegations made in Battle's report.
So she's saying she has evidence that directly contradicts what Battle is claiming.
Yes, and it's important to note that the Department for Children and Families, or DCF,
Right. DCF.
they also got involved in this case.
Yeah.
And they conducted their own investigation.
Okay.
Investigator Michelle Merritt interviewed the children in January 2024, and her findings seem to contradict what was in Battle's report.
So what did the DCF investigator find?
So according to the complaint, Merritt didn't find any disclosures of abuse from the children during her interviews.
Interesting.
She even noted that the children's responses seemed kind of prodded, like someone might have been influencing what they said.
Okay.
And she expressed concern about the father's potential influence in all of this.
So right away, that raises questions about where these allegations are really coming from.
Right, and it casts doubt on the reliability of those initial claims that led to Mrs. Miller losing custody.
Now, this is where things get even more complicated because later on, in June 2024, there's a recorded phone call that seems pretty crucial to this whole story.
Yeah, so in this recorded call on June 5th, 2024, DCF investigator Merritt states that she has no concerns about Mrs. Miller's parenting.
Really?
And she even goes so far as to say she felt the father was potentially causing some harm.
Wow. So the DCF investigator is now expressing concern about the father.
Exactly. And she says in that call that she was planning to mark the case as unsubstantiated.
Meaning there was no evidence to support the abuse allegations?
Correct.
So we have the agency tasked with investigating these claims saying they don't find any evidence of abuse.
Right.
But then what happens to this information?
Well, this is where the complaint alleges a serious breach of conduct.
Okay.
Ms. Miller claims that the guardian ad litem, McCalla, he knew about these DCF findings before that January 29th hearing.
You mean the hearing where they took her kids away?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet she says he failed to tell the court about this information that could have potentially changed everything.
So why would he allegedly withhold this information that seems really suspicious?
It definitely raises some serious questions about the fairness of the initial proceedings.
It makes you wonder what his motivations might have been.
Yeah, and to add to that, it seems like the DCF case wasn't closed in a timely manner either.
Okay.
The complaint details that McCalla was allegedly communicating with DCF supervisors between May and October of 2024.
Okay.
And Ms. Miller believes that this contributed to a significant delay in officially closing that case.
And so then what finally happens?
Finally, on January 22nd, 2025, DCF General Counsel confirms that the allegations were unsubstantiated.
Okay, so they're finally saying officially that there's no evidence of abuse.
Right. But they attribute this delay to what they call an unintentional oversight.
So after all this time and all this stress, they're saying it was just an oversight.
Yeah, and unfortunately doesn't end there.
Oh, no.
Because just one day later,
Okay.
on January 23rd, 2025, a new DCF report is filed.
A new report. What is this one about?
This one alleges emotional abuse stemming from Mrs. Miller's social media activity.
Her social media.
Yeah, so this leads to what Mrs. Miller calls a retaliatory substantiation on March 18th, 2025.
Hold on. Substantiation, meaning they officially found evidence of abuse.
Right, but in this case, it's related to her social media, and Mrs. Miller is saying that this was done in retaliation for something.
And she didn't get a chance to respond to this new report.
That's right. She claims that this substantiation happened without any notice to her or a hearing.
Oh.
And she's actually challenging this in a separate federal lawsuit now.
So we've got these allegations of potentially false reports, a lot of back and forth with DCF, and now this issue with social media.
There's a lot to untangle.
It is, and we haven't even gotten to the other individuals named in this lawsuit.
Right.
So let's move on to Julia Battle, who is the children's therapist.
Okay.
What exactly is being alleged against her?
So the complaint alleges that Julia Battle conducted 69 therapy sessions with Miller's children.
69?
Yes, between 2023 and 2025.
Okay.
And what's really concerning is that Miller was reportedly excluded from all of these sessions.
Wow, so she wasn't allowed to be present for her own children's therapy.
Right, and the complaint says that the father and stepmother were included in some of these sessions.
And was there a reason why Miss Miller was excluded?
So this exclusion allegedly violated a court order from February 13th, 2023.
Okay.
That order mandated joint parental involvement in the children's therapy.
So both parents were supposed to be involved.
Exactly. And then there was a subsequent order from July 22nd, 2024 that appointed a sole therapist,
Okay.
implying that any other sessions outside of that appointment might be considered unauthorized.
So 69 therapy sessions and one parent is excluded despite court orders to the contrary.
It seems like a pretty significant deviation from what the court had directed.
It does, and I imagine there are some financial implications tied to all of this as well.
Absolutely. So Battle reportedly billed $3,230 for these unauthorized sessions.
Okay.
And this included charges that were made to Miller's credit card
Wow.
without her consent.
That's what the complaint states. And even more concerning is that some charges were allegedly made to her MasterCard without her consent.
So she's being billed for these sessions that she wasn't even allowed to attend.
Right, and it gets even more complicated because the invoices themselves seem to reveal a connection between Battle and McCalla.
The Guardian ad litem. Yes. So according to the complaint, the invoices show communication between them before that January 29th report.
The report that led to Miss Miller losing custody.
Exactly. And there's even a charge on one invoice that seems to relate to McCalla requesting an updated report from Battle.
So it looks like there was some level of coordination between the therapist and the GAL.
That's what the complaint suggests.
Now let's talk about the third individual named as a defendant in this case.
Okay.
J. Stephen Hazel, the psychologist. What was his alleged involvement?
So the complaint states that Hazel conducted a psychological evaluation of Mrs. Miller on March 18th, 2024.
Okay.
And this evaluation was allegedly unauthorized.
Okay.
It was supposedly done at the direction of McCalla via email.
Okay.
And this email falsely indicated that the court had approved the evaluation.
And had they?
Mrs. Miller says no, that there was never a court order for this evaluation.
And what about the results of this evaluation? Are they being disputed as well?
Yes, so Hazel reportedly deemed the results of the evaluation inconclusive. But then the complaint says that he still went ahead and issued a report based on this evaluation.
Okay.
But he did this without getting Miller's consent.
Okay.
And without even giving her a chance to review it before it was finalized.
And then what happens to this report?
Well, according to the complaint, this report was then used against Miss Miller in the child custody proceedings.
So essentially she's being evaluated without her consent. The results are inconclusive, but a report is still issued and then used against her in court.
That's what the complaint alleges.
It's pretty disturbing. And did Miss Miller take any action in response to this evaluation?
Yes, she filed a motion to try to get Hazel's evaluation excluded from the court proceedings.
Okay.
And she also filed a formal complaint against Hazel with the relevant licensing board.
Okay, so we've got these really concerning allegations about false reports, unauthorized therapy sessions, and a questionable psychological evaluation. And on top of all of that, the complaint also outlines some pretty serious claims of obstruction and retaliation against Mrs. Miller.
Right, these are key parts of her case as well.
Yeah. So what do these allegations entail?
Okay, so the complaint alleges that McCalla retaliated against Miller for her protected speech.
What does that mean, protected speech?
So in this case, it refers to her advocacy related to the custody case.
Okay.
And the way he allegedly retaliated was by pressuring therapists to delay the reunification process with her kids.
Delaying her getting her kids back?
Yes. And this pressure was supposedly based on her social media activity.
Her social media? How so?
Well, he allegedly misrepresented her private online activity as being public.
Okay.
And then he filed a motion in court to try to restrict her social media posts.
So he's trying to control what she posts online.
That's what the complaint alleges.
And there's also that detail about McCalla's wife subscribing to Miller's business mailing list back in 2021.
Right. That seems to suggest that they were monitoring her activities.
It does make you wonder if this has been going on for a while.
Right. And to make matters worse, Mrs. Miller claims that she filed motions in state court to try to overturn that initial custody order and to remove McCalla as the guardian ad litem.
Okay.
But both of those motions were denied without any hearings.
So she's trying to fight back, but she's hitting roadblocks at every turn.
That's how she's portraying it. And there's also the issue of access to important records.
Right. The complaint alleges some pretty blatant obstruction there.
Yes, so Miller claims that both McCalla and Battle refused to provide her with crucial records, even though she tried to get them through subpoenas, a motion to compel, and even HIPAA demands for healthcare information.
And for how long did this go on?
Well, the complaint states that it wasn't until almost a full year after her children were removed that reunification therapy even began.
A whole year without any progress towards getting her kids back? That's just heartbreaking.
It really paints a picture of a really difficult and drawn-out battle in state court.
It does. So let's shift our focus now to the actions taken by the state court itself as they're described in this federal complaint. What are some of the things that Mrs. Miller is taking issue with?
So there are a few key things that she highlights in the complaint. On April 1st, 2025, her trial, which had been scheduled for later that month, was canceled.
Canceled why?
The stated reason was that she hadn't paid the guardian ad litem fees, which had amounted to over $13,000.
$13,000. That's a huge amount of money.
It is, and this happened despite Miller's claim of indigence, meaning she couldn't afford to pay those fees.
So she told the court that she couldn't afford it?
Yes, and there was even an earlier indication from the court that those costs could be sorted out at the trial.
But they canceled it anyway.
Yes, and that raises some serious questions about whether someone without a lot of money can really get a fair shake in family court.
It's concerning to think that someone's access to justice could hinge on their ability to pay, especially when they've already stated they can't afford it.
It really does make you wonder how often this might be happening.
And were there other issues with the state court besides the canceled trial?
Yes, so Miss Miller also alleges that she was denied access to the state's electronic court record system.
They call it e-court, right?
Right, and she believes that this denial violated the Kansas Open Records Act.
Which guarantees public access to government records.
Exactly.
So she's saying they were blocking her from seeing public records.
That's her allegation, and she also claims that there were filing restrictions specifically imposed on her because she was representing herself in court.
So they were making it harder for her to file documents because she didn't have a lawyer.
That's what she's saying. And on top of all of that, her attempts to get accommodations for her disabilities were also unsuccessful.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So according to the complaint, Ms. Miller has documented PTSD, ADHD, and something called litigation abuse syndrome.
Litigation abuse syndrome, what is that?
It's basically the psychological distress that can result from prolonged and intense legal battles.
Okay, so basically the stress of this whole situation is causing her further harm.
Right. And she made formal requests for ADA accommodations to address these disabilities. But the court denied those requests without even holding a hearing.
So they didn't even consider her requests.
That's what the complaint states, and to make matters even worse, there's an allegation that the judge was mocking Mrs. Miller for relying on certain legal protections.
What protections are we talking about?
So the complaint says that the judge allegedly mocked Miller's reliance on Marsy's Law,
Okay.
which provides rights to crime victims and also the Violence Against Women Act, or VABOA,
Right, VABOA.
which is meant to protect victims of domestic violence.
So these are laws that are specifically designed to protect vulnerable individuals, and she's being mocked for using them.
That's what the complaint is alleging, and she also feels that the court just ignored the alleged misconduct of the other defendants.
So after all this back and forth with the state court, what has been the impact on Meghann Miller personally?
Well, as of April 7th, 2025, when she filed this federal complaint, she had been separated from her 5 children for over 14 months.
Wow, over a year without her kids.
Right, and her contact was extremely limited.
Okay.
She was only allowed 2 weekly reunification sessions with her younger children, and she had no contact at all with her older children.
So she's been kept apart from her kids and limited to just these short visits.
Yes, and as you can imagine, this has taken a huge emotional toll on her.
Absolutely. I can't even imagine what she's going through.
The complaint states that she's developed PTSD and litigation abuse syndrome as a direct result of all this.
And beyond the emotional distress, what about the financial burden of all this litigation?
Right, so on top of everything else, she's had to deal with legal fees and the stress of her trial being canceled because of those unpaid fees.
And she claims she can't afford them.
Exactly. And she's saying that she was forced to sell her home and lost her job because of all the trauma and disruption caused by this legal battle.
So she's lost her kids, her home, and her job.
This case really highlights how these kinds of legal proceedings can completely upend a person's life.
It's just devastating. So given everything we've discussed, what legal claims is she actually bringing before the federal court?
Okay, so her complaint lays out a pretty comprehensive list of claims against the defendants. It includes allegations of deprivation of due process, both procedural and substantive.
Okay, now can you break that down a bit for our listener?
Sure, so due process is a fundamental legal right. It basically means you're entitled to fair treatment in legal proceedings.
Okay.
Procedural due process refers to the steps that have to be followed, and substantive due process is about protecting your fundamental rights.
Okay, so she's saying that both the process and the outcome were unfair.
Exactly. And she's also alleging violations of her First Amendment rights,
Okay.
specifically her right to parental association with her children and protection against retaliation for speaking out about the case.
So they can't punish her for advocating for herself.
Right. And there are a number of other claims as well, including conspiracy to interfere with her civil rights, violation of her parental rights fraud, and misrepresentation denial of access to her children's health records, failure to prevent civil rights violations, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, violation of equal protection, and even violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Wow, that's a lot of legal ground to cover.
It shows just how many different ways Mrs. Miller believes her rights have been violated in this whole process.
And Johnson County itself is also named as a defendant in this lawsuit, right?
Yes. So Johnson County is being sued for alleged violations of due process and equal protection. And Miller is arguing that these violations occurred because of the county's own policies and practices.
Related to how they run the guardian ad litem program and the standard court procedures.
Exactly.
Now, there's one more important legal point that I want to make sure we touch on, and that's the question of why the federal court should even be involved in this case.
Right, because there are already ongoing proceedings in state court.
So why is this a matter for federal court?
So there's a legal principle called the Younger abstention doctrine.
Yeah.
Which generally prevents federal courts from interfering in state court cases, especially those dealing with family matters.
So basically, federal courts try to stay out of state court business?
Right, but Mrs. Miller is arguing that this doctrine shouldn't apply in her case.
Okay.
She claims that the state court proceedings have been full of bad faith and harassment.
And that she's suffering irreparable harm.
Exactly. And that creates an exception to the general rule allowing for federal court intervention.
So she's making a pretty strong case
for some pretty significant relief.
So what exactly is she asking for?
Well, she's seeking both declaratory and injunctive relief.
Okay, can you explain what that means?
Sure, so declaratory relief would involve the court making formal statements about the rights of everyone involved.
Okay.
And injunctive relief would involve the court ordering the defendants to do specific things or to stop doing certain things.
Okay, so like a court order.
Right.
And what specifically is she asking the court to order in this case?
So she's requesting an immediate temporary restraining order, or TRO.
Okay.
And this TRO has several components. She wants the court to immediately restore her parenting time with all 5 of her children.
So she wants her kids back.
Yes, she also wants the court to force the release of all those records that she's been trying to get.
Okay.
She wants the court to ensure that ADA accommodations are provided for her disabilities in any future proceedings.
Okay.
And she wants the court to stop the defendants from engaging in any further unlawful actions.
So basically, she's asking the court to step in and protect her and her rights.
Exactly. And in addition to that, she's also seeking monetary damages.
So she wants financial compensation for the harm she's suffered.
Right. She's asking for at least $20 million in compensatory damages to cover her financial losses, the loss of her home, the emotional distress she's endured, the loss of her relationship with her children, the mental anguish, and the physical harm she says she's experienced.
$20 million, that's a significant amount.
It is, and it shows how seriously she's taking all of this.
And is that all?
No, she's also asking for $30 million in punitive damages.
Punitive damages, what's the difference?
So punitive damages are meant to punish the defendants for their actions and deter them from doing something similar in the future.
Okay, so it's not just about compensating her for the harm, it's also about holding them accountable.
Right.
Now the immediate focus seems to be getting that temporary restraining order as quickly as possible.
Yes, so on April 7th, 2025, the same day she filed her complaint, she also filed that ex parte emergency motion for the TRO.
And just to remind everyone, ex parte means she's asking the court for this relief without giving the defendants notice.
That's right, and the reason she's doing it this way is because she believes there's a real risk that the defendants could tamper with evidence or retaliate against her if they knew she was taking this action.
So she's trying to protect herself and her kids.
Exactly. She's arguing that the situation is so urgent that she needs the court's immediate protection.
Well, this has been a really heavy deep dive,
It has.
but it's so important to shed light on cases like this where serious allegations of misconduct are being made within the legal system itself.
Absolutely. And it's especially crucial in cases involving children who are often the most vulnerable in these kinds of situations.
What really stood out to me was the fact that Miss Miller is alleging a pattern of behavior here.
Right. It's not just one isolated incident.
Exactly. She's describing a series of events that raise serious questions about the conduct of court-appointed officials and the way the system is operating in her case.
What's particularly disturbing is the alleged suppression of evidence that could have helped Miss Miller.
Right. We're talking about the initial DCF findings that showed no evidence of abuse.
And the fact that those findings were allegedly withheld from the court during that crucial hearing.
It makes you wonder how things might have been different if that information had been presented.
It really does. And then there's
Yeah.
the issue of those unauthorized therapy sessions.
69 sessions where Mrs. Miller was excluded despite court orders.
And the psychological evaluation that was reportedly conducted without a valid court order.
And we can't forget about the cancellation of her trial due to unpaid fees, even though she claimed she couldn't afford them.
All of these details together paint a very concerning picture, and it really makes you question whether justice is being served.
It's a reminder that we need to be constantly scrutinizing these systems that are supposed to be protecting families and children.
Right, because sometimes those systems can fail, and when they do, the consequences can be devastating.
Exactly. And I think this case really highlights the importance of due process and making sure that everyone has a fair chance to be heard.
Right, everyone deserves a fair hearing, regardless of their financial situation or whether they have legal representation.
Absolutely.
And this case also underscores the importance of holding those in positions of power accountable for their actions.
Right. We can't let misconduct slide, especially when it involves vulnerable individuals like children.
And this case really leaves us with some tough questions to ponder.
It does.
In a system that's designed to protect families, what happens when the people in charge of that system are accused of causing harm?
What recourse do people have when they feel like the system has failed them?
These are questions that we all need to be thinking about and discussing because they go to the heart of our justice system and how it operates.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation, and I want to thank you for helping us break down this complex case.
Of course, and thanks to everyone for listening.
And for those of you who are interested in learning more about the topics we discussed today, I encourage you to do your own research.
There are a lot of resources available online and in your community.
And if you've been personally affected by any of the issues raised in this deep dive, please know that you're not alone. There are organizations and advocates out there who can help.
Don't be afraid to reach out for support.
And finally, I just want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
In a society that claims to value family and the well-being of children, how do we ensure that the systems we have in place are truly serving those goals?
It's a question that deserves our continued attention and action.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive. See you then.